welcome, all of you that are here. Good morning. Well, morning my time. Of course, it varies where you are. So, well, we have some interesting questions to deal with. I'm going to take them oldest to most recent, and we'll have a chance to uh, have a little discussion, along the way. Um, so I hope you all have access to the questions. I'll read through them before I answer them. I'll do that out loud. But if you can follow along on the website and on the Patreon website, that will be helpful to you, I'm sure. So, my first question is from Arta Siggen. And actually, the second question from Till Gable, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, from Till, are similar in topic. And so, and I think they're probably the outcome of some comments I made towards the end of the last, Q&A session we had. But let's begin with Arta's question. He said, I want to ask your thoughts on whether consistent psychedelic use is a good idea on the path to awakening. I've never used it, but a friend of mine extensively uses the substance called 5-MeO DMT. He says that this is 4 to 5 times more effective, a 4 to 5 times more effective psychedelic than DMT, and produces, and I'm not going to read the rest of this until I've responded as we go along. I want to ask your thoughts on whether consistent psychedelic use is a good idea on the path to awakening. No, because the things that produce consistency are in themselves problematic. And I would say the very, very judicious use of psychedelics in life for various purposes under appropriate circumstances is a good idea. That's a very highly qualified statement. And in terms of on the path to awakening, there are occasions where it can be very valuable. As a matter of fact, I could pretty much say almost all of the Western Dharma teachers of my generation began our spiritual journey with very extensive use of psychedelics under very uncontrolled circumstances, which led many of us to pursue Eastern philosophies and Buddhism in particular. And many of us, unfortunately not myself, I wasn't in a position to, went to Asia and studied in various monasteries. So consistent psychedelic use is problematic for a whole variety of reasons that I don't know whether it's necessary or appropriate to go into, but that'll depend on what anybody has to say afterwards. But there is a place for a very judicious use of them in proper circumstances with proper guidance for maximum effectiveness. He goes on to speak of 5-MeO DMT, which is 4 or 5 times more effective. That is true. And now here's the part I left off. And produces an insight experience, an ego death so profound that you know yourself to be God. An ego death so profound that you know yourself to be God. I'm sorry if I have to laugh at this statement, but you can probably understand what I do, why I do. Now, there is a sense in which this is true, you know. There's a sense in which not only psychedelics, but as a very real part of the spiritual path, you realize that there is no separateness between you and whether you want to call it God or whatever it is, that something is so vastly greater than you than your human mind could ever fully comprehend. And you realize that your your inseparable oneness with that, which is to which is kind of the truth buried in these statements, which I that make me this statement that makes me laugh. And ego death so profound that you know yourself to be God. So sure, you can move mountains and you have power over life and death. And what does he mean by that? I don't know. But anyway, he says, one, you are literally God and you are infinite. Um, who is this you that is literally God and that is infinite? These are profound experiences. Um, no doubt, they are very profound experiences. Everything is love. That is absolutely true. And people discover that without psychedelics as well. But this is a very, very profound spiritual truth. Death is 100% an illusion. Well, so is life. Life is a dream, yes. What we experience normally is a controlled hallucination. It's a good way of describing emptiness. Uh, the world we live in and the life we live, the story that we tell about ourselves and who we are, is completely created by your mind, which is a very important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about 5-MeO DMT or LSD or psychedelic mushrooms or anything else. Um, Materialism is wrong. I certainly agree with that. Brain is part of this controlled hallucination. Well, brain is material, right? Um, and as far as I'm concerned, there's only one non-dual stuff that from the outside appears to be physical in nature and from the inside appears to be mental in nature. Um, there is no objective external material world. Um, if if the person means that there is nothing that exists outside of their mind, then this is a mistaken insight. If by this they mean that the objective external material world that they think they know is a mind generated uh, illusion, well, that's absolutely true. That's what we mean when we say that things are empty. They're empty of being what they appear to us to be. They're the limitations of our senses and the limitations of the what our mind can make from our senses, which gives rise to the world that we perceive. Um, so there is no objective. Okay, so perception is a part of this hallucination. Uh, yes, it is. But if we ask the question, just what is, well, that we can put this at a level that includes earlier, there is no objective external world. Everything, absolutely everything is contingent upon something else, many other something else. And in fact, everything is contingent on everything. And one's mind, what the events that one's mind creates as a person's reality, as their external world, is entirely contingent. And so it would be solipsism for one to believe that there is only the mind that they experience as their own consciousness. Their conscious experience represents a tiny fraction of their mind and is a product of that unconscious mind. But there is something beyond the individual mind. Make no mistake about that at all, okay? But anyway, he says that no self is a beginner level insight. Uh, yes, that is correct. And that is exactly how it's presented in Buddhism and in many other traditions as well. Uh, he's saying, uh, compared to what is possible to realize on 5-MeO DMT, and normal meditation, even TMI, will only partially get you to these states and realizations. This is being said by somebody who's never achieved these things through uh, nor what he refers to as normal meditation. So keep that in mind, Arda. He says that these realizations are infinite. And by using 5-MeO DMT, he claims to realize certain truths that no other spiritual master has talked about. Is such a thing possible? Do you agree with his realizations? Well, I kind of went through as I was reading them. I commented on. I know that you make a distinction between states and stages. I think what he means is between states and traits. Um, Insight, embodiment, yes. I make a very important distinction between temporary, transient states and traits, especially when those traits involve the way that one perceives oneself and what and the wholeness that one is a part of in one's relationship to that. And insight embodiment it's a good way to describe that. But my friend says that you experience these insights, although temporarily on psychedelics, with 1,000 times the depth than traditional meditations. Well, you experience these with 1,000 times the um, non-critical evaluation that you would otherwise. Um, that is true. So you're wide open to these, and so they hit you with full force. And he believes that this is important considering people meditate for 10 to 20 years with very little to show for it. Well, he has a good point about that, but the answer isn't 5-MeO DMT or other psychedelics. It's it's doing it's anybody who's practicing a particular meditation technique or meditation techniques and has nothing to show for it needs to be meditating differently. They need a different method. They need a different teacher. They need something. The only reason I ever ever started teaching, and I never intended to. As a matter of fact, I had sworn that I would never teach. But then I started having people come to me who'd been meditating for years, many years, who were very ardent meditators, very dedicated meditators, whose belief in the path and its validity was unshaken by their inability to succeed in their meditation. And so I couldn't not give them advice. TMI is a direct outcome of that. It is a meditation manual that has helped many, many people who have practiced for long periods of time and have had nothing to show for it, to be able to understand what it was that meditation was about and to succeed in that. He also says that permanent insight embodiment and temporary insight experiences are dualistic notions, and they collapse after the experience of time is seen as an illusion. What would you say or advise to this person? What I would say or advise to everyone is this is a very good example of something that goes beyond 5-MeO DMT, beyond all psychedelic substances. Your mind can create things that are beyond your ability to imagine unless and until your mind has generated those experiences. That is your mind. Your mind generates experiences in dreams that are, have you never had a dream that you thought, my God, if my mind could only exhibit that kind of creativity in my daily life, I would be the most famous author, movie director, um, you know, you name it, that there ever was. Your mind is capable of creating things that are absolutely astounding to your ordinary waking consciousness, and it does it to everybody in your dreams. Um, all kinds of psychedelics do this in very unpredictable ways and in very temporary ways. We can look at what happens in psychosis. As a matter of fact, for a very long time, those things that we now refer to as psychedelic or entheogens were previously known as psychomimetic drugs, which means that they mimicked psychosis because the psychotic mind can produce experiences and entire complex realities that are so different than anyone else ever experiences that they that uh, they're just absolutely incredible. And what people don't realize is that the consensual reality that we live in is just, Stanislav Grof pointed this out. The only difference between a person we call psychotic and an ordinary person that we consider to see the world in a normal way is that we see it in the same way they do. So if we too were psychotic in the same way, then the psychotic reality of somebody else would seem like the only one that made sense, and we would see everybody else as crazy. And you can't tell me you don't know a whole bunch of people who kind of think that anyway, right? Yeah. So there's a truth here to this. Number one, no conscious experience you have, no matter how complex, no matter how profound, no matter how incredibly moving, no matter how intense, no matter what associations it has emotionally or otherwise, no matter the degree of awe you experience or things like that, it is still a mental formation. It is something created by your mind. And from the physical point of view, it's something that your brain plays a very important part in producing. And that's why it happens in dream states. And that's why it happens with psychedelics, which alter the way your brain functions. And that's why it happens in various kinds of psychoses where brain function is disturbed in measurable ways. You know, so there is no limit. The thing that most of us learned from psychedelics back in the day was exactly that to believe that this reality or any other reality you experience is reality is nonsense. And well, I had that experience when I was 15. I became a seeker after truth. It took me quite a while, and it really helped to make it clear to me when the good old 60s hit. I was in my 20s and started playing around with mescaline and psilocybin and things like that. It sort of solidified what I had been discovering since I was 15, that everyone is equally deluded. We get along and think that we're living some kind of reality because we all share the same delusions because we learn these from birth. And that's what psychedelics did for me and so many others, was make us realize just how incredibly limited this conventional reality that we shared was. And for those of us who 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 sought a deeper truth, that's what profound means, profound, uh, a deeper truth, something closer to some kind of ultimate. This is what motivated us to try to find a better way. And we read about mystics, and we read about, of course, most of the Western mystics are inaccessible to us and few in number and hidden in the modern day. And all we have is the writings that have been preserved of some of the more famous um, Muslim and Christian and non-Christian mystics. Um, and we discovered that in the East, a lot of these traditions still lived. In Japan, and China, and India, and places like that, Thailand, and Burma, Tibet. So we sought a better way than psychedelics. Psychedelics had opened the window, and what your friend is experiencing with 5-MeO-DMT is glimpses into that deeper, more profound reality. He's also being misled by some of the things his mind creates that aren't windows into that deeper, more profound reality. Just as some of the examples here, like an ego death so profound that you know yourself to be God. Like I say, there is a way of interpreting that statement that is true, but based on everything else he says, I'm pretty sure that this is what this is a very profound illusion, not a very profound insight into a deeper truth. On the other hand, when he says that, and you are literally God and you are infinite, that is true. Does he understand the sense in which that's true after the experience is over with, though? That's the question. Everything is love. That's absolutely true. But does he understand how and why everything is love? And does that stay with him after the 5-MeO-DMT experience ends? Which, by the way, is a very short one. I have done this. As a matter of fact, I've milked my own Sonoran desert toads. I live where the Sonoran desert toads live. And I've milked the little glands on their head onto a piece of wax paper and let it dry and smoked it. So I know what he's talking about. I'm not talking through my hat. This is through experience. Life is a dream. That's true. He's had a glimpse into a much deeper understanding. That much deeper understanding is what is described and written about as emptiness. Materialism is wrong. He's absolutely correct in there. There is no objective external material world. There he has taken the information provided by these temporary glimpses and totally misunderstood. Perception is a part of this hallucination. Yeah, he got that, but he somehow lost the fact that there was something outside of that. If his qualifier as objective means that he's there can be an implication in that he's talking about what appears in consciousness. Well, yes, absolute truth is never going to appear in human consciousness. We can know so many things about what is ultimately true, but we can't know ultimate truth in and of itself. To my favorite quote that illustrates this is only the mind of God can know the mind of God, or only God can know the mind of God. So I would say if he could give up his attachment to the intensity of these experiences, and recognize the difference between temporary states and a permanent shift in perception in which the very truths that he's had a glimpse into become part of his ordinary experience of reality on a daily basis, then that would be really good. He hopefully is ready for that. So Arda, please, try to communicate this to him. This is what I would tell him. He's ready. He's ripe. He's seen through so much, but to make that into a living reality, to have a permanent shift in perception. And one thing that I think that he does not realize, and perhaps you could let him know about a true spiritual path, is that there is no end to it, at least that I know. I'm not going to back off on that. There is no end to it. There's no end to what remains to be discovered. Um, I don't know. Maybe if you lived 1,000 years, you would exhaust completely both the extent to which the human mind could be cultivated to perceive things more as they really are, uh, especially with whatever technologies might be developed over that 1,000 years. But the fact is, only God can know the mind of God, and so there's inevitably one is going to reach the limits of uh, what the human mind is capable of. I like to give the example: if you take uh, one of the earlier forms of sentient life, of say some very primitive uh, organism, maybe like a frog, right? And you compare them in the comparatively short period of time that evolution has brought to uh, our way of perceiving the world. And our perception of the world goes so vastly beyond that of a frog. Now, the other thing that we notice in the evolution of mind uh, over time is that it's accelerating. The curve is exponential. Now, imagine what some species maybe that replaces us after we finish annihilating ourselves, or if just in the normal course of things, every evolution continues. Let's jump ahead to some time in the future. Let's pick a uh, let's let's make a jump 50 to 100,000 years from now. Now, if we can trust what's happened in the last billion or so years on this planet, and the exponential curve that we're on, in 100,000 years, there are going to be beings whose mental capacities exceed ours as much as ours do a frog's. Okay, I feel pretty confident of that. Um, I'm sure that mind is going to be able to create mental constructs that attempt to represent ultimate truth in a way that so vastly exceeds anything that we can hope to in our short lifetimes. Um, so this is a journey without an end, and that's the wonderful thing about it. And this journey continues. We're just a part of it. He says there's no death. Your friend says there's no death. He's seen this in DMT. Well, certainly, yes. All this body of mind is, all of mine is, all this mind of mine is this body and mind are just a particular transient process that represents the convergence, a nexus of causal influences. And it has arisen contingent upon causes and conditions and will pass away contingent upon causes and conditions. Yet I am a part of something much, much greater. And that mind that I talk about 100,000 years from now, that's going to be an outgrowth of all of us, just as we're an outgrowth of all of those early amphibians that who had their own perception of the world that was limited to water and land and advantages of each, and flying insects that were good to snatch with your tongue, and so on and so forth. So yeah, Arda, your friend, if he can get out of the little dead end that he's stuck in, he's really rough. He's really ready to go. Okay, and he's with the insights he has. I'll leave you with one other thing. Leonard Cohen was a very dedicated Buddhist practitioner in the Zen tradition. And one of his songs, the lyrics of it are, "Ring the bells that still can ring. There is a crack in everything." Now, like in Zen, all of Leonard Cohen's lyrics have multiple meanings. That part of it represents, you have the image of there are bells, even cracked bells, that can still ring. So that there's this imperfection in the world, and the most perfect bell eventually cracks. But he goes on to say, "Ring the bells that still can ring. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through." And what we're talking about here, what 5-MeO-DMT has given your friend, is more cracks for the light to shine through. It's time, it's time to go beyond looking through cracks with the help of with DMT or anything else, and to begin removing the veils of delusion. And the beginning of that is staring you in the face. The beginning of that is realizing that you cannot trust the states that your mind can create on a temporary basis. You can learn from them. You can learn from them, but don't make the mistake of thinking that they're any more real than that person you met and you immediately knew that they were the wrong person. Or maybe that person that you met and you immediately knew that they were perfect for you for the rest of your life, and then all you got was your heart broken. Life is full of experiences like that. But the cracks that the cracks that Leonard Cohen was referring to, and the cracks that DMT is giving you access to, are ones that do show you to a deeper truth. So they're worthwhile. He just needs to move beyond them. Those are early baby steps. We all took those baby steps a long time ago. Then Till has a question. He says, "I joined this type of question from a different angle. In an ayahuasca ceremony, being outside and looking up, I suddenly saw everything: house, trees, the sky, people, my own thoughts, in a completely different way. First, everything was luminous, bright, vibrating, a vast space. Second, it appeared and disappeared at an extremely high rate. One could also say that it was like a water fountain, solid and yet not solid. Third, it was like a giant display, an immense screen that I could look at, but this looking was subtly different. I kind of had to turn my head, keeping the eyes fixed. Fourth, it had an emotional quality of endless awe. Fifth, my mind said, this is all me, whereas the me was everything that arose. This state," and I'm glad he recognized that as state, "lasted perhaps for a few minutes. I should add that in the minutes prior to this, inside my eyes seemed to throw two distinct light beams to whatever I looked. I could actually enlighten the walls with bright light at will." These are all pretty classic meditation experiences that not everybody has, but neither are they uncommon. This left such an incredible impression that eventually I picked up TMI. Way to go. And now I'm reading Tibetan Bon instructions translated by Daniel P. Brown, which to me come closest to express much of that depth of experience. Good for you. You're looking into traditions that can give you access to this. I had zero prior meditation experience. This happened at age 63. I'm now 65. I have only once re-experienced this state in lesser form when looking at night at a water fountain. My meditation motivation comes largely from these few minutes. Sometimes I experience a somewhat similar non-dual state when meditating on the Autobahn, with podcasts as my meditation object or with eyes open. However, the experience of luminosity is then not present. Probably a good thing when you're driving on the Autobahn. The question is, I am now pretty convinced that the descriptions I read in, for example, the 6 lamps, referring to luminosity, brightness, self-driving, vastness of appearance of phenomena, are not just metaphorical, They correspond to the actual meditative experience. Is that true? Yes, absolutely. Certainly is. Also, the more immodest question is, did this experience, without an experiencing individual self, correspond to some kind of awakening experience? I have to say that this experience was more formative for me than many of the other more symbolic or emotional experiences. Well, uh, does this correspond to some kind of, yes, what happened is you had an experience that resembles in many ways the way, the new normal that you would experience in association with awakening. Yes. And this experience was more formative for me than many of the other more symbolic or emotional experiences. And properly so. Properly so. The emotional experiences arriving from the most primitive part of your mind. They're wonderful, and they will always be with you. They will always be a part of, if you achieve awakening, they will be a part of that ongoing experience of awakening, most especially the awe that you refer to. Um, I believe that was you, and I'm not carrying it over from the last one. Um, anyway, uh, and the symbolic comes from one of the most recent developments in the evolution of mind, brain, and mind, which is the ability to condense a vast amount of knowledge and experience into a symbol, and then to be able to use those symbols to deal with a much greater variety of experience, knowledge, understanding, etc., than you would be able to uh, were they not in the condensed form that they are. But the problem with this is that for what is gained, something is lost as well. And so you, just as with these emotional experiences, this ability, I mean, if you look at the at Zen poetry or Chinese Chan poetry, or the poetry of some of the Indian mystics or the Christian mystics and things like that, you'll see how they've come to the place where they can, well, just look at the poem Little Gidding and the what he does with language. Anyway, both the emotional and the symbolic have their place in the awakened mind, but neither by itself is. Let's put it this way: either by itself can be temporarily misleading you into thinking that you understand and grasp more fully something than you really do. Um, and so, in between those two is the experiential, which can be translated into the symbolic and can be understood in a larger scale uh, uh, using the symbolic, and the experiential, which has its emotional component. And its emotional component has profound lessons to teach you. There is much intelligence in the emotional brain. But uh, uh, this realm of experience, which is what meditation is all about, is where the answers you are seeking are to be found. And you are absolutely right when you say that this experience was more informative for me than many of the other more symbolic or emotional experiences. You're right. And it included the symbolic and emotional, or at least after the fact, it would have included the symbolic. And you're thinking, you thought about it afterwards and you've written about it here. And I'm sure you've discussed it. So I have to add that since these experiences, I am more and more in a state of compassion after having insights into my own trauma. That is one of the most wonderful things about ayahuasca. And I don't recommend that the use of psychoactive substances. Um, I just I don't recommend that people go out and say, "Oh, let me try this," like we all did back in the '60s and early '70s. Um, I got to be known as a trip doctor because there's so many gatherings in the park in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Houston where, you know, somebody'd be having a bad trip and they'd call me over to talk them down and things like that. I don't recommend that. You mentioned an ayahuasca ceremony. Now, of course, now that ayahuasca's caught on, it's very hard to find somebody who's a true ayahuasquero who has been properly trained. You've got a lot of people with minimal training and minimal understanding. But to attend an ayahuasca ceremony, to use ayahuasca ceremonially with the appropriate music and all of the other things that a trained ayahuasquero brings into it, um, is a very profoundly useful and psychologically healing experience. It will, as it has with you, uh, lead you to some more serious, uh, I shouldn't say, I don't want to sound like I'm in any way taking anything away from the value of an ayahuasca experience or of a Native American church ceremony that uses peyote. Those carried out by professional roadmen who can provide the guidance and assisted by has the proper assistants, trained assistants working with them. That is extremely valuable. The mushroom velada, using mushrooms in the ceremonial way of the oh, I can't remember the name of the Indians, but they're the one that do this beautiful, elaborate beadwork, which is actually an expression of how one tends to see everything when using large doses of mushrooms. Um, with trained guidance, and I would include in that the people who are currently doing research on psychedelics with both therapeutically and in order to advance spiritual development. Um, they have they have at least hopefully they have enough knowledge, and they realize and appreciate what Timothy Leary said about set and setting and how important that is. That's what keeps those bad trips in the park from happening. Um, so I do not take anything away from the enormous value uh, of psychedelic substances used under the proper circumstances. They can be very valuable, but I don't recommend them to be used uh, uh, based on some instructions that you've read on Reddit. Please don't. Okay. Anybody have anything to say after, I've covered two different major powerful psychedelics here and how I see the relationship to spiritual path and awakening and the lessons that they hold. So I was happy to respond to anyone on that.
I have some questions.
Sure.
Hi. I think now I got confused a little bit because everyone always talks about when you do psychedelics, you can kind of learn and get insights. But now, if I understood properly, what you're saying is that all these insights or these experiences you go through, they're just mind created. They're just more illusions. So then what can you really what are you getting insight to? What are you learning about if it's not reality itself? If at the end of the day it's just another illusion?
Okay.
How can that be valuable in terms of, you know, getting insight into the actual reality, if that's even a thing? Yeah.
Great. Yes. Great. Okay. First of all, yes. Uh, what what the Buddha referred to and what I'm referring to is seeing things as they really are. And we could qualify that a little bit. The Buddha didn't, and I quite understand why, but I feel it's appropriate to see what we're doing is seeing things more as we really are, as they really are. We're seeing through delusion. In the very path that the Buddha described, as insight, you don't have an insight and now you've seen things as they really are. That insight continues to mature and deepen. And as a matter of fact, each of the 5 insights that I list in the introduction and TMI, which is a conceptual way of organizing this, are different aspects of the same, what you might call insight, awakening, the awakened state insight. Each contributes, but they must all be present and they must all reach a sufficient degree of maturity for us to use the word awakened, to an awakened perspective to describe them. And that's called stream entry. That's the beginning. There are 4 paths described, and that's only the first. And the 4th is called a path as well. And that path leads to many paths beyond that. So there's a really good reason for wanting to see things, see through the current delusion that you're seeing, because all of these experiences that people are having in meditation and in drugs, with drugs, are what they are is what the mind is always doing. And the only thing that you will ever experience consciously is the mind's best representation in that moment of reality based on the information it has available to it. Okay? And there's ultimately going to be a limit to that. Like I say, even if you lived for 1,000 years, there's ultimately going to be a limit to just how far you can go. But to see things more as they really are, and then 1,000 times more as they really are, and then another 1,000 times more as they really are beyond that, and so forth. That is what it is like to progress from first path through the paths that the Buddha described, beyond that through the paths that have been described by some of the Mahayana teachers and are described in the Mahayana Sutras. There is this journey goes so far beyond that. Who would not want that? Now the thing is to know that at any point, and I've had this experience where I feel like, oh my God, I understand it now. I'm there, I've got it. And after dwelling there in that place for a while, suddenly having opening up of a whole new world. It's like another veil removed. And all of a sudden I realize, oh my God, there is just so much more to explore. And it is so much more wonderful. And that wonderful place was still a place of delusion. And there is this much more wonderful place. And so I've gotten past the point of ever believing when a brand new vista opens to explore that that's going to be the end of it. My only hope is that I'm going to live long enough to reach the next one. So there's very good reason for that. One of the biggest problems in meditation today in the West is not being able to distinguish temporary experiences from established, stable states that the mind can dwell in an ongoing way, as opposed to a temporary state, which gives you a taste and then passes away. It's like taking a cherry and you taste it and the richness and the tartness and the sweetness and everything, but then it's gone, right? And all you have is the vague memory of how good it was and of that sweetness and of that tartness, I make a clear distinction between insight experiences and insight. An insight experience is that temporary taste. It's that one cherry. An insight is where there is a permanent change in your perspective and that you see the world from the perspective that you saw during that experience. And that experience and that taste wasn't necessarily exhaustive. As a matter of fact, it couldn't even approach being exhaustive, because if you're at a place where you have insight experiences into the interconnectedness of everything, that you have if you have insight experiences into emptiness, or experiences into realization of no separate self, of that everything is process and things like that. If you're at the place that you're having those experiences, then those experiences are going to be limited as compared to, imagine you're living in a place of realization of no self. You're living in a place of ongoing recognition of emptiness. You're living in a place of ongoing interconnectedness, and therefore the interdependence leads to everything is constantly changing as a result of causes and conditions. Everything is totally contingent. Now, imagine what kind of insight experiences that you have, and you will. Those insight experiences are glimpses into what lies yet beyond the next door, right? So does that answer your question? As that's why it's worth doing? It will always be empty, which means that there is always a more profound understanding awaiting. I can't hear you, Pablo. You're muted or something.
But then that means that in a way, the ultimate. Oh, sorry. Let me.
Yeah, you're breaking up a bit. I think you may have an unstable internet connection.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it's a little bit choppy. Now I can't hear you. I can see your lips move, but I can't hear you.
Well, can you hear me better now?
That's perfect. Yeah, got it.
So, okay. So then, does this mean that the goal of one day being able to see reality exactly as it is like basically impossible? Since there's like, what this seems to me now is that we are always seeing reality from a place of illusion, and all we can do is to diminish the illusion, but it's basically impossible to remove illusion because we have a human mind and we don't have God's mind. Is that correct?
All right. Let me just give you a different way of visualizing that, okay, that you might find better. You can see this much of reality exactly the way it is. And as you progress, you can see this much of reality exactly the way it is. And then this much of reality exactly the way it is. And that keeps expanding. Are you ever going to see the totality? No. No. Are you ever going to be able to grasp in consciousness everything beyond time and space? No. But you can see that much and that much, and you can see beyond time and space in that much, and beyond that in that much. That's within the realm of possibility. Can you look at it that way? As you're expanding your horizons of what you can see as it really is.
Right. Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah. And it's actually more encouraging also to keep going on the path.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's, especially in what's called the pragmatic Dharma movement, people who make experiences in meditation, and there's, it's kind of like with psychedelic drugs. You can have all kinds of experiences in meditation, and a lot of them are the same as ones you have with psychedelic drugs. People who can People who teach meditation in a way that intentionally leads to those kinds of experiences arising, and then they construct those experiences in such a way that when you've had certain experiences, you can put a label on yourself as, I'm this much enlightened. You know, uh, this is sort of like this is exactly the same place that the first person that Arda was talking about was stuck with his 5-MeO DMT, is that he was taking experiences which had some tremendous validity, but they were still just experiences. And if somebody came along, which this person could probably do, and started giving other people 5-MeO DMT and then saying, well, when you've had these experiences and this one and this one and this one, then that makes you a non-returner. And then when you have these other experiences, you're now an arhat and things like that. What a pile of nonsense.
Yeah.
Experiences, states versus traits, temporary, transient experiences. I'm fond of saying this, usually in less public forums, but experiences aren't worth shit. Well, experiences are valuable and we learn a lot from them, but by themselves, they're not worth shit. And to mistake these experiences for the goal of the journey, or to think that you can gather together a collection of experiences and that will constitute some spiritual accomplishment, it frustrates me, because it takes away from the wonderful truth that lies there waiting to be understood and appreciated. So, okay, well, let's look at some other, unless somebody else wants to comment on this whole topic, we'll move on to another question.
I have one question.
Okay.
So if we were to, let's say, open your skull and start like removing parts of the brain, do you think at some point we would remove enough that these permanent traits would be gone?
That which would be gone?
The permanent traits.
Oh yeah, as a matter of fact, that's a pretty well established fact. As a matter of fact, it goes way beyond that. But the thing is, those traits would be gone, but it doesn't mean that they would be replaced by a superior trait. It's just something would be gone. They used to do a horrific thing where they'd stick a needle up through the thin part of the skull above the eye, and they'd wiggle it back and forth until it severed a lot of the fibers connecting the prefrontal cortex to the rest of the brain. And they did this as a treatment for people that were considered hopelessly psychotic. And sometimes it just turned them into vegetables, but sometimes it turned them into very happy vegetables. Right? So for every, one thing I have no doubt of is, and this has to do not with materialism, but with non-dualism of mind and matter, is that for absolutely every mental experience, there is a corresponding neurological correlate. Okay, for absolutely every mental experience, no matter how small, no matter how hugely awesome, there is a neural correlate for it. Because mind and brain are the same thing. Mind is not an epiphenomenon of brain. Brain is not just an imaginary thing created by mind. Mind and brain are the same stuff, right? It's brain when you look at it from the outside. If you cut the top of your skull off and looked at it in the mirror and you poke needles in it and stimulate it, and then you felt things, and then you'd have that experience of your brain from both the inside and outside at the same time. Don't do that at home.
So, but you mentioned experiences. So experiences have a neural correlate, but what about the traits? Because you make a distinction between the traits. So there's a permanent shift in awakening
Yeah.
that would have a neural correlate that you can get rid of, for instance, or that you can undo, maybe.
Yeah. Yes. If you I don't know. I'm not sure if you're saying, could you take somebody who was awakened and had developed this ability to perceive things more as they really are, and started removing parts of their brain? Are they going to lose that? Yeah,
Yeah.
except that they're going to retain part of it too, because it's not located in particular parts. It's distributed throughout. Think of the mind as, or think of the brain as a system, a dynamic, complex system that's capable of many, many states. It's self-organizing. It can create new states for itself. It can take previously stable states and modify itself so that it doesn't enter into those states anymore. And it can create new states for itself, which it can then easily find its way. And those states can become very resilient, where anything that perturbs the brain as a system so that it leaves that state, it quickly finds its way back. Okay, but it's the entire brain that's involved in these states. And so that's why, it's not, there's going to be a neural correlate, but the more complex the mental phenomenon, the more widespread it is throughout the brain. As it becomes a trait, it means this is a state that has become extremely stable and extremely resilient, right? That's what makes it a trait rather than a transient state, rather than being a little dip that it gets to sit in for a short period of time until the slightest perturbation comes by and knocks it out again. This becomes a deep well that it resides in. And even if it gets knocked out of it, there are many channels that lead it back into that well. And that well corresponds to seeing the world from the perspective of insight. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, my question was really a proxy to a different question, which is the idea of this permanency of the shift in perception that happens after awakening. So, the real question is, can those traits be undone by, I don't know, by certain actions that we carry out after awakening, for instance, or certain habits that we perform or that we get after awakening? Or even in the case where, I don't know, we have this well in the energy landscape, but I don't know, we suddenly remove a little bit of it, and because everything is interconnected, that thing has causal consequences that make the well unstable again.
Absolutely. Let me remind you, Ricardo, that everything arises contingent upon causes and conditions. Everything passes away to a contingent upon causes and conditions. In the beginning, that well, it may not be so deep. Over time, you deepen it, but the same thing, you could make it more shallow until eventually it even becomes inaccessible. It could go either way. The thing that contributes to the stability and the resilience of the kinds of uh, states of being of the brain mind of an awakened person are the incredible positive aspects of it. That, so as a complex state, dynamic state that is self-organizing, it is going to preferentially reinforce and make sure that all paths lead to that realm of that superior state that is, as the Buddha put it, liberates one from suffering. It liberates one from suffering, and to the degree that it liberates one from self-clinging and from craving, it liberates one even more so from suffering. One of the things that we discover after that first breakthrough at stream entry is there's still forms of suffering present. There's still forms of craving present. There's still forms of self-clinging present. So we continue to, and as a matter of fact, the mind is naturally predisposed to work in that direction, having found something that is so much better, right?
So yeah, so craving in a way is kind of pernicious and tries to get into it, into the mind again. So if you're making this well deeper, there's another force that's working against it constantly throughout our whole life. Maybe, I don't know. It's an idea.
Well, the thing is that let's not oversimplify it as being a single well. It's multiple wells that give the system adaptability. If it were relying on a single well, then something could happen that could undo that. But right. Anyway, let's look at some other questions here. We got some more research.
Culadasa, I just wanted to very quickly say that my question is like at the end, and if we run out of time today, I'm perfectly comfortable answering this tomorrow. Just wanted to say that right now.
Oh, well, let me see what we've got here. We've got one from yeah, I think we can go ahead and look, since you're here especially, I'd like to. Your question, how is Buddhist text structured, organized? I'm curious how does one go about reading them? Ideally, I would like to read the text in its original script and explanations in English. How does one go about learning Pali, and do you have recommendations for books that discuss important parts of the Buddhist text? Okay, this is what I was putting the links in the chat, if you saw those, and if you'd like to open those so that you, right now, so that you can save them later. I'm going to ask the person that posts this to make sure that those links in the chat are there. But you say, but first I want to explain how they are structured. Is they're organized into groups based on, I mean, there is a tremendous lack of systematization in organization. The major suttas are organized in the Digha Nikaya, which is the longer sayings. So in other words, all of the longer teachings are put together in one book. The Majjhima Nikaya is all of the middle length sayings. And then there's short sayings. And then there is a collection that is numbered. So it's where he treats, there's suttas where he treats a single issue, suttas, and then that's the book of ones. And then there's a book of twos where he treats two issues. And then there's a book of three where he treats three issues. So you see the organization of the suttas is not very helpful. There is a fantastic book called The Life of the Buddha according to the Pali Canon by Bhikkhu Nanamoli, I believe it is. And what he has done is he's taken different suttas. And the other thing about the suttas is it's very difficult to tell when these teachings were given in time. But he's gone through and found different suttas and tried to put them in order that corresponded to the Buddha's life and his teaching to the best that he can. So that's a book that I would really highly recommend, is Nanamoli's Life of the Buddha according to the Pali Canon. There are a number of other very good books out there. Analio has written a couple, and there are, I can't remember the names of some of the people. There are some books that would help you get started, but I would say Nanamoli's might be one of the best.
Okay.
Now, I'll tell you what these links are about. Okay.
Okay.
Now, this first link is the Polytext Society's Pali English Dictionary. Now, this is a fantastic resource because it not only gives you every interpretation of a Pali word or a part of a Pali word, it gives you many examples of where it's used in the suttas, which can help you see the meaning of it.
Right.
The one little problem here is when you're using different Pali texts, they use different scripts. There's many different fonts, I should say fonts. Even the same Pali text is different computer fonts will present it differently. And so sometimes you have to mess around a little bit in order to find the parts of the word that will get you the whole word that you're looking for in the PTS dictionary. Okay, but it is a fabulous resource. And the second link that I have here is one that goes through all the suttas, and it gives them in English and in Pali. And you can go through and you can find the same passage. You can find a sentence that you don't quite understand or you have doubts about. One of the things about any English translation is it reflects the translator's bias and the translator's skill and the translator's right. But something comes across and you want to know more about, you find the corresponding sentence, and using the second link, you go to the Pali version, you find exactly the same sentence. It's a little bit tricky. It helps to know a few Pali words in advance, and you'll learn them just by doing this. You're going to learn a lot of Pali.
Okay.
Then you can use the Polytext Society Dictionary to translate that sentence or that phrase or that word or whatever it was, and see if you can answer your own question or make more sense of it or improve upon the translation or whatever it is that you have there. So these are two links that I have used together very, very many times. This is an example of where they use different fonts. Now, I found what I wasn't able to find before this is I do have something that will convert one font into another font. And I haven't used it in several years, and I'm pretty sure it's made it onto the current computer I use. But it's very handy for this. But the reason I stopped using is I got really familiar enough with the different Pali fonts that, if I put something into the PTS dictionary and it said not found, I would immediately know, I need to change this. And this S with a line over it, if I put it as a double S, then it'll come across right.
Right.
There are a number of courses that you can do online helping you to learn Pali, and so you can do that. One of the things that, and this really, I'm just going to look at your question again real quick. I think I've already answered everything that you've asked in that question. And I see you have another question yet, but I want to go back to the question that we skipped because it brings up a very important thing. A good friend of mine is engaged in religious Buddhism and even aspires to become a monk. What I say next may be biased in some way, but I will try to describe my understanding of his path to the best of my knowledge. My friend interprets the suttas, early Buddhist texts, quite literally and believes in reincarnation, predictable karmic effects on your future lives, heaven and hell realms, renunciation from the world, etc. Also, he thinks that the whole material world or existence is samsara, that it is bad, and something to be transcended through a spiritual path. Also, for him, an arhat is someone who is also practically perfect in his conduct. I recommended your book to him, but he does not believe that you are an arhat because of the recent allegations, so he will not even read it. Well, first of all, Vladislav, what I want to say about your friend is perhaps he's not aware that the Buddha's teachings were transmitted orally only for 500 years after he originally gave those teachings. And within within a century after the Buddha's passing, there were 18 different schools that we know of Buddhism, each having a different version of the suttas. And many of these schools and their versions of the suttas disagreeing profoundly on some of the most fundamental teachings of the Buddha. This was within a century, and some of these schools died out. Some of their versions of the canon of suttas were translated into Sanskrit because there was a schism in the Buddhist Sangha, and they divided into two groups, and one group translated everything into Sanskrit. So there are extant some Sanskrit versions. The Tibetans have a good collection of those, but they were also they also went into China, and the Chinese were into writing much earlier than the Indians were. And so some of these earlier versions of the suttas constitute a body of scriptures called the Agamas, the Chinese Agamas. And much has been learned by comparing Chinese Agamas, which were taken from the oral tradition and translated into and written down in Chinese at different times during this 500-year period before the Pali Canon was written down in Sri Lanka. The Sanskrit versions, actually what I should say is they were translated into Sanskrit, but they too were being transmitted orally. It wasn't until about 70 years after the Pali version was written down in Sri Lanka that the Sanskrit versions were written down. But some of this oral Sanskrit transmissions were written down in Chinese. So scholars have what was written to compare, and they compare the Pali Canon, which your friend is becoming attached to these Chinese agamas, and agamas that came from the Sanskrit from different schools, and agamas that came from the Pali in different schools. And they can look at these and they can see that huge portions of sutras have been removed and replaced by something that was corresponded to the beliefs in those schools. That subtle changes, single words have been changed, which can change the entire meaning of a sutta by just substituting one word for another. That things have been added in that obviously were part of the pre-existing Vedic religious traditions of India. That things have been removed that conflicted with those pre-existing Vedic teachings, of which by the time that this was all taking place, India had evolved from little tiny principalities that consisted of little more than a large village or a small city to gradually increasing empires. And as these little empires became bigger, they supported various religions. And so a lot of both Buddhist and non-Buddhist schools began to compete for support from the wealthy people and from the people that were politically close to the king or emperor, or the king or emperor himself. And so these people had, and their, what they wanted Buddhism to be, had a profound influence on the development of those schools. In other words, kind of like what happens in the modern world today, money and power drove the versions that these different Buddhist schools took in that period before the canon was finally written down. So for somebody to, like your friend, to go to the canon and want to take everything it says literally true, is he's going to get into some trouble. Now, even after this was written down, look at the huge variety of schools and the different ways of interpreting the Buddha's teaching that have arisen. At one end of the spectrum are the Zen schools. At the other end of the spectrum is Tibetan Buddhism. And not only that, Tibetan Buddhism has a variety of different forms which disagree with each other about some very fundamental issues. And then there's Theravadin. And then there's all the different schools that arose in China. The Chan, which is eventually became Zen. The Huayan, which is one of my favorites, based on the Flower Garland Sutta. The Pure Land. There's so many different schools of Buddhism, and they interpret the Buddha's teachings in such profoundly different ways. So that what your friend is setting himself up for, I'm afraid, is to fall into this trap of, it's very much like Christian fundamentalism, following a particular school, assuming that the scriptures in the form of the suttas that he has access to are the literal words of the Buddha, which they by no means are, and basing his own spiritual development on that. I'll just comment on something. He doesn't want to read my book because he doesn't think I'm an arhat. If my book has any value, it shouldn't matter whether I'm an arhat or a monkey, right? It shouldn't make any difference. It either produces results, which I know it does because I've observed it personally, or it doesn't. So tell him to stop being silly and at least have a look at my book, no matter what he thinks. And then there's a reason that he doesn't think I'm an arhat, because of recent allegations. Anybody can say anything they want about anybody. One of these days, I will probably respond. I intend to respond to that. I feel a need for it. I feel a need for it for the sake of people like your friend. In a way, it breaks my heart that he would deny himself the opportunity to take advantage of the book that I wrote and the books that I'm working on writing because of what somebody said about me. So I have to, I feel like for his sake, I've read on Reddit about people that they've thrown their copy of TMI in the trash now because of what was said about me and things like that. I'm going to have to respond. I haven't been able to for some time. First, I had to figure out, my God, why on earth did they do this? And what are they talking about? This had nothing to do with my lived reality. And then the second thing is that I filed for divorce with my wife. We're in a collaborative divorce process. And since she was behind this whole thing, I can't really say anything publicly in response to that until our divorce has finished. Once that's happened, you'll hear from me. And the other thing is, it's not just your friends that are not making use of my teachings because of what has been said, but all of those people who were and still are, but feel hurt and confused because of what was said. So tell your friend I'm going to deal with that. Geez. But in the meantime, let the book stand on its own. And it shouldn't matter whether I'm an arhat or not. It shouldn't matter whether I'm an asshole or not. Okay? So how would you advise to find a common ground with such a person? I'm not trying to persuade him. I just want to have a productive communication about spirituality, even amongst our differences. Well, I think you've identified that just in what you've said. We spend lots of time together, so having harmonious communication without arguing constantly is important for me. Also, if you personally have some thoughts about this literal religious approach to Buddhism and why you don't follow it, I would gladly hear your views. I think I've already dealt with that. What I would say is always begin any discussion with your friend about the things that you agree on, and then gently, with regard to his sort of fundamentalist approach to the scripture and any particular school that he's following, if you can very, very gently say, by the way, were you aware? And you could pass along some of the things that I've said. By the way, are you aware that the Pali Canon that you're relying on wasn't written down till 500 years after the Buddha passed? And that might surprise him. And then you could leave that conversation there until next time or whatever. Or if he wants to pursue it farther, you could say, and are you aware that within a century after the Buddha passed, there were 18 different schools with completely different versions of this? And this is all a historical fact, well known, well documented. Just gently guide him to maybe a more open view. You don't want to convince him of something different, because that's very hard to do with anyway. All you want to do is open his mind so that he can discover for himself. Give him a few pointers that, well, why don't you look in that direction and see what you find? Yeah, but where you find something that you agree on, talk about that. And if there are some of the things that you mentioned here, if they come up as a part of that, you can maybe just gently point out how, well, there's different ways of interpreting that. And I don't see why one would be particularly more valid than the other. And I'll just take as an example, where the Buddha mentions things like the rebirth of the self or of I. You say, doesn't that happen all the time in all of us? Don't we all have different selves? Are you really exactly the same person that you were 20 years ago, or even a month ago, or will be in 5 years? And just say, isn't the self something that gets reborn in different forms all of our lives? Why is it necessary that whenever there's some, by the way, the word that is translated as rebirth, one of the things you might point out to him, one of the things that I usually might be interested in investigating is the word that keeps being translated in the suttas as rebirth actually just means birth. The re part of it, that is a carryover from Vedic reincarnation. By the way, carne from the Latin means meat. Reincarnation means re-meatification. So, being made into a piece of walking meat again. So you could just say, you could just gradually lead him to investigate these things, and it's not you convincing of him of anything. It's just you being just the very gentle guide to open his mind up to discovering things that he might find much more rewarding. So I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Thanks, Culadasa. If I can comment on it, just one thing.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Yeah, first of all, thank you for your very wise answer. He's very aware of the point about oral tradition, and his answer is that it was very meticulously passed further, like 10 monks were gathering in the room and reciting together or something like this. And then there is now a movement to uncover the early Buddhist teachings, like Ajahn Sujato, Ajahn Brahmali, they work to, there's a book which is called Authenticity of Early Buddhist Texts, and this is his main research and explanation that this is why the early Buddhism is more authentic. But I completely understand your points.
Well, it's good. I'm glad that he's already aware of that, because the more he pursues that, the more it's going to undo his fundamentalist approach to interpreting it. Yeah, as scholars come more and more to agreement in terms of classifying which suttas were spoken, there's the early suttas, the middle suttas, and the later suttas. And the more clarity that comes to that, the more you can compare the early to the middle and later. And you can see two things. You can see an evolution in the suttas. Also, there's many suttas are repeated, and not only are they repeated, but they're repeated as parts of other suttas. So you can find parts of this sutta that are repeated as parts of 3 or 4 other suttas as well. And of course, these belong to different strata, right? So there's 2 things that can be learned from comparing those strata. One is that you can see how obviously some of these suttas have been altered more, and there's more different versions of them that exist to validate those. And those are generally categorized in the middle and later category. The other thing that you can see by comparing the strata, and there are things that begin to stand out because they're very consistent. The Buddha was a very brilliant teacher, and anything that appears to be a contradiction or circular thinking or anything like that, you can be almost certain involves something that's been changed. So you can tell your friend that. The other thing that you can learn by comparing these strata, which is enormously valuable, is how the Buddha changed the way he taught, how he introduced new terms and new ways of presenting things as he went along in order to meet the changes in the audience that he was teaching to. Initially, he was teaching only a small group, a very dedicated people who had withdrawn from the world, many of them who had already studied for many years under various other teachers, just as the Buddha himself had. But as this grew, there came to be more and more people who were new to this kind of study and practice, etc., and so on. And so he had to change his teaching. Things that in the early strata, he takes, for example, he takes for granted that people already understand that when he uses a word like samatha, that they know what that means, or when he uses jhana, they understand certain things. Later on, when he introduces the Eightfold Noble Truth, we find he's separated out sati and samadhi from each other. Very interesting. And then we find out at the very latest, the word that everybody makes a big deal about is vipassana. And we find out that is one of the latest terms added to the suttas. There are very few references that use the word vipassana in the suttas, and that these are late, because before that, the people that the Buddha was teaching understood what vipassana was, which most people today don't. It means using attention in such a way that you see beyond the initial appearance. You just observe in an open way, and you let what you're observing tell you its truth. That's what vipassana means. But he took it for granted in his teaching and was able to for a long, long time. And then he realized there's people that develop samadhi and there's no vipassana in that. Their samadhi becomes this closed-minded, narrow-focused thing that doesn't have the ability to see beyond the initial appearance. It just stuck right at that initial appearance. So he had to introduce that concept and say, for those that have learned shamatha, by which he means sati and samadhi, but have not learned vipassana, then they better go learn vipassana. And for those who only learned vipassana, but have not learned sati and samadhi, they better go find somebody to teach them shamatha, right? That's the Yoganada Sutta. So, yeah. There's so much to be, I'm glad he's interested. Keep pushing him in that direction. If he's at that stage, I would say, maybe you could challenge him. I don't know the nature of your relationship, but maybe you don't have to be so gentle. Maybe you can just challenge him on a few things. Pick a few things that they're just obviously contradictory and don't make sense and push him on it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to answer Ayesha's last question really quickly, and then I got to end this because I have another major event happening shortly in a few minutes. Okay. Oh, there's another question from Ricardo too. Ayush says, as I understand it, an arhat is someone whose craving and delusion has been permanently extinguished as a result of awakening, and consequently there is no more scope for the arising of moment-to-moment becoming or rebirth. I don't understand why such an arhat wouldn't just let this conventional life end and transition to parinirvana as a natural consequence. At the moment, how would the intention arise in the arhat to get up from the couch and to continue living the conventional life, especially if the arhat has not been asked to teach or hasn't found interested people who want to learn? Well, Ayush, the fact is that there are some people who do exactly that. They just withdraw into seclusion. Those are the ones that I'd say that they get to fourth path, but they don't go beyond it. They don't recognize it as a path. They withdraw into the bliss of suchness. They dwell in emptiness. They withdraw from the whole world of relative truth and appearances and stories and everything like that. And it's a sad thing. It is a sad thing because their personal spiritual growth has come to an end. And there's a lot of benefit that they could do if they remained active in the world. I'd say the main thing that keeps an arhat with two things. One would be not carrying into his arhatship the delusion. One aspect of ignorance that hasn't fallen away is that there is more there. And the Buddha taught that. He once with regard to the dirt under his fingernails compared to the earth, another time comparing a handful of leaves to the leaves in the forest, but he said, there is so much more that I haven't taught you than what I have. And he was referring, I mean, you look at what he taught, and yes, he stopped with fourth path. He didn't go beyond that. Probably wasn't much sense in doing that, except in private with his arhats. Who knows what he said there, you know? But it's kind of yeah. Okay, so compassion. To the degree that an arhat has compassion, one of the things that they would have experienced, some of these people might not even be arhats, but one of the things that somebody experiences on third path is the fact that they know that they're not separate from all of this suffering that exists, that even though they can withdraw into the bliss of just dwelling in suchness, and it was out of compassion that the Buddha taught. His first response is, you know, well, nobody's going to understand this anyway. Why should I waste my time trying to teach anybody? And Brahma came and begged him and said, there are those with a little dust in their eye. And the Buddha recognized that. And he spent 45 years after his awakening teaching, right? Is it 40, 45, something like that? I mean, anyway, died at 85. I guess it was 40 years teaching. So he spent another 40 years teaching out of compassion. And that's why anybody, arhat or beyond, is going to do that, is out of compassion. Why else? Out of compassion and out of realizing that there is so much more. For one thing, in order to explore that so much more, you cannot do that in seclusion. there is a return to the marketplace that's necessary in second path. There's a return to the marketplace that's separate, that is necessary in fourth path. As a matter of fact, I would say that progress from second path onward depends on being active in the world. And certainly getting through second path and progressing after attaining fourth path depend on being involved in the world. So that's another reason right there. Very quickly, Ricardo, you once said something like there is some evidence to believe that there are more paths after fourth path. Well, I didn't say evidence. I use the word evidence usually in a very precise way, but I have very strong reasons to believe. All right, I won't make any bones about it. In my own experience, I know that there's so much more beyond that. It's just a fact. It's become obvious. It's become obvious to me in my observations of others who have reached this, and the things that people have said. I found it really, really obvious in the Mahayana teachings. I found it really, really obvious in Dogshan's 5 ranks, which is, Dogshan is a founder of one of the Zen traditions. It's gone into even much greater detail in the Chan tradition that prior to the arising of Zen and Dogon and the Soto Zen tradition. So yeah, there's a whole lot of reason to believe that fourth path was just as far as it was worth talking to thousands of bhikkhus and lay practitioners was about. So he stopped there. And that's what the handful of leaves and the dirt under the fingernails means. So thank you all. Got to rush. But I've kept you here probably longer than you really wanted to be anyway. So I enjoyed it thoroughly. I hope you did too. And look forward to our next chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Culadasa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.